Ladies and gentlemen, today Senior Minister of State Jeffrey Siow actually made a very important announcement that let me finally understand why GIC and Temasek performance is where they are. Okay, so let's just watch on and hear what he says. Well, the top headlines basically that SMS Jeffrey actually said is Singapore will not benchmark GIC and Temasek with other funds. So it doesn't matter. All the funds across the world are doing better than GIC and Temasek. We will not benchmark against them. We'll benchmark against this thing called mandate. That's a very interesting statement, and I think a lot of people will be very curious to find out what on earth does this mean. So SMS Jeffrey Siow made this statement in responding to a parliamentary question around the sovereign fund's performance. And the purpose is to address a lot of media and public criticism that our GIC and Temasek funds are poor relative to global peers. And it basically sets a expectation that Singapore, the way we evaluate sovereign funds is very different for other countries. And what triggered this whole parliamentary discussion is basically Financial Times actually make analysis and compared Temasek and GIC performance against other benchmark, other global funds, and wow, our performance is really bad against some of the other funds. And I think I already done a video on that. And basically, the narrative of the Financial Times basically says that Singapore sovereign fund underperform against global standard. Well, the government response is no, okay, because this way of benchmarking is not what Singapore benchmark itself with. So I'm going to read some of the headlines and you understand why this is. So the GIC to de-risk preemptively was a matter of judgment, Jeffrey Siow. So the SMS for finance says that the state investors' prudent judgment at a time that led to foregone returns, but it performs within expectation. Now, what does this mean? I'll read and explain. So SMS Jeffrey actually say that that because we want to de-risk ourselves against a very high risk environment, so GIC took some positions that there is a lot more conservative than probably what other funds did, and as a result, miss out on some investment returns in recent years. And it was a matter of judgment. And despite that, the fund has met the government's expectation. Now, I didn't say it met the international benchmark, but it met the government's expectation. So, in addressing some of the questions in Parliament, it basically says that the fund expected increased market volatility and say that the valuations were heightened. So it took preemptive measures to moderate its risk assessment exposure. And the measures were taken in recent years were intended to keep portfolio risk within acceptable limits and to guard against the possibility of a significant asset impairment if markets fell sharply. So basically, they took conservative positions in case there's a jibaboom, of some form, okay? And that's a matter of a call, okay? But equities market continued to go boom, 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 higher and higher and higher. And as a result, this was, in hindsight, of course, a de-risking exercise that took away a lot of returns. So that's basically what he says. And however, GIC has performed really well in the past, so therefore we should leave the professionals to do their job and not take a look at short-term returns, but focus on long-term returns and so on. And basically, they say that GIC has performed up to the government expectation. So that's the government's assessment of GIC. Now, let's talk a little bit about Temasek. Temasek recent performance was affected by the Chinese market. Chinese market, I told everybody, is a market I wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. But Temasek has quite a significant position in China. And to be frank, the early years, Temasek has actually done well in China, but in the recent years, not so good. And fortunately, there was some mitigation and offsetting from Europe and the US, but it's probably not enough. So What is the returns? Actually, they quoted some numbers and I thought it was quite interesting. The GIC return in real terms is 3.8%, 20 years inflation adjusted. So assuming inflation is about 2% in Singapore generally, so we're about 5.8%. That's GIC. So you can see 5.8% really speaking in the nominal terms is actually a very, very low risk approach. So they take a very low risk position compared to that of maybe the S&P 500 or equivalent. The Temasek 20-year shareholder return is about 8% in USD terms. So in Singapore terms, of course, it's probably going to be lesser because over 20 years, I think the USD actually went down quite significantly. But SMS Jeffrey actually said that it's reasonable and within expectation given their respective mandate and risk parameter. So the key revelation that I have today is the government's position is we are not benchmarking against all these other funds. Okay, they do well is their business. They don't do well, also their business. We assess ourselves against mandates. And these are probably mandates such as, we can't take too much risk. We must be able to generate enough cash to fund, some of the government coffers. And we want to make sure that the Singaporeans' savings are maintained and things like that. So there's a series of mandate that I'm just guessing what these probably are, and I don't think I'm far away from it. So it emphasized on very long-term returns, not on, annual returns and things like that, which some of these funds are. So what's GIC mandate? Well, it's a national financial shock absorber. It aims to preserve the international purchasing power of our reserve. So it needs to make sure that we can fight against inflation and acts as a national shock absorber and reduce risk whenever there's market extreme. So never mind, we forego some upside as long as we don't suffer the downside. That's basically what he's saying. And actually, that's not entirely wrong as an approach. And Temasek's mandate is different. Temasek mandate is bottoms up selection, concentrated exposure, net portfolio return. Okay, and basically, giving some company level size return. So now maybe we can make some comments. Is this the best approach we can think of? Well, the mandates are defined by the government, right? Actually, to be frank, this is the first time I hear this kind of mandate being spelled out in this way. And to be benchmarked only against the mandate is a questionable one, right? Now, it can be right, can be wrong, depending who sees it. I'm not a government, so I cannot tell you whether this is right, this is wrong. Now, then the question is, how are other sovereign funds usually judged? Okay. And to be frank, they also have their mandate compliance, but a lot of times they do get a peer comparison as well against other sovereign funds, against public index like S&P fund, NASDAQ, MSCI World Index or whatsoever, and do some risk-adjusted returns benchmarking as well. So instead of a dual mandate, they only have a one mandate for GIC and Temasek to solely benchmark against internal mandate. And that to me is quite unique or maybe even unusual. So are these mandate critical to Singapore? Very, because our country has only our national reserve as our fallback. So we cannot afford to take risk, okay? So therefore, in that sense, protecting our national reserve comes at the highest priority. So we cannot afford to take that kind of risk. So the National Reserve serves a lot as a shock absorber. And in terms of crisis, like the COVID-19, we came out as a saving grace for the whole country, and that was important. And I believe that part of our CPF inside is inside, and we cannot afford to take any risk on our CPF. And it also provides some fiscal support for Singapore government. And we don't want a case where there will be forced asset sale during market crashes and so on. So maybe, right? Maybe the question is, not so much so defined, A and B or A or B, but maybe should have both, but in different degree. So I still think that there should be some kind of a mandate benchmark and a international benchmark of some form. So basically, I think that um, being able to be benchmarked, at least in small part, to say, okay, how do I perform against other countries? They have their own mandate as well, right? So I think we cannot go away from some of that. This is my personal opinion, but again, I'm not the government. It's easy to say from a from a position of watching, but I suppose my government will be different. Um, the Singapore approach, well, it's a safe approach, very low risk approach, and so that we invest so as never to fail as a nation. That's one thing. But the individual approach is to maximize lifetime compounding. So when we wear the lens of individual to look at investment versus we now wear a lens and look at government investment, maybe there's different. So I think growth is probably our personal responsibility. The government is more focusing on stability. So that's why we see this kind of low end returns. So let me hear your thoughts, right? Do you find this acceptable? Do you find this not acceptable? My personal view is cannot run away without some international benchmark, okay? But maybe we don't put like a like 70-80% towards those international benchmark, maybe 50-50, 70-30, whatever, right? You cannot run away to live there and just say, oh, we're just way against mandate. Uh, I think investments no need to be binary. You can afford to be a continuum, right? This is why we have a portfolio approach, right? So let me hear your thoughts. Okay. Thank you. I'll see you in my live stream. Bye bye.